You are a scientist, a physicist to be exact, and you are a physicist that works for many different world governments with regards to and with relation to NATO, right? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. With that being said, you've been given a top secret cosmic clearance, which, again, at the time of what you signed your NDA and your contracts and all that, from what you understand and perceive, that is the most classified or secretive department, at least to your knowledge. So you're a physicist and a quantum physicist, mind you. You're getting into that whole realm of things, and you start to realize, okay, I'm doing work for all these different government bodies. I'm signing NDAs. There's, they literally tell me in the NDAs I may end up dead if I end up speaking about what I'm doing here. I have a pretty good idea on a personal level. I'm reverse engineering, not just esoteric, I guess you could say, technology or 0-point interfacing technology, which our friend Camden will be covering very shortly. But I'm also noticing that every time I walk in and out of these laboratories, the other scientists that I'm working with are starting to look less and less human each and every time that I go in and out of that lab. Not like, okay, one day I notice they look human, I go the next day, they look a little less human, they look a little more frail, a little more sort of gray, alien looking type. No. You go in the lab, you do your work, you go for lunch, you come back, and you see all of a sudden that these scientists or your colleagues that you're working with, they're humanoid, they're bipedal, but their necks are thinner, their jaws thinner, everything's thinner, the whole face is thinner. Okay, now before I get into all this, I do want to say that we do have a Patreon. It does help support the show, and I also wanted to mention as well that this entire show is sponsored by Black Oxygen Organics. Head to blackoxygenorganics.com/Generation Z to get a discount at some of the products that personally, I will say, I did go through other things too in the past handful of months, but this product helped me lose a lot of weight. I'm not saying it is the end all be all, but I do want to say that it is quite significant. With that being said, let's jump right into it. So first off, the title, Camp X Gepetto, Garnering CacoDEMONIC excuse me, it's a little bit hard to pronounce, Annealments to manifest alternative arcanes, and in brackets, universe number 25 and Phobos 2. Now, let's break all of this down because you might be saying, Dave, that sounds quite complicated and I don't know what the hell you're talking about. I don't mean to confuse you folks, quite the opposite, to the contrary. So let's take a look. Merriam-Webster.com, arcane stands very simply for known or unknowable, known or knowable only to a few people. Okay, so basically a secret, essentially. But the reason why it's called alternative arcanes is, again, you will see very shortly. Now, the next thing is this right here, CacoDEMONIC, okay? Of or relating to evil spirits, by extension of a person, okay? And then, what does annealing mean? Annealing, according to wikipedia.org, in metallurgy and materials science, notice, by the way, before we go on, metallurgy, the association with the alien craft and the metals and the subatomic structure that we covered in the previous public episode and elaborated on even further in the members episode. But anyways, and I quote, in metallurgy and materials science, annealing is a heat treatment that alters the physical and sometimes chemical properties of a material to increase its ductility and reduce its hardness, making it more workable. It involves heating a material above its recrystallization temperature, maintaining a suitable temperature for an appropriate amount of time, and then cooling. In annealing, atoms migrate in the crystal lattice and the number of dislocations decreases, leading to a change in ductility and hardness. Okay, as the material cools, it recrystallizes. All right, end quote. Now, the reason I bring this up, folks, is because if we take a look here on this page, as it pertains to atoms migrating in the crystal lattice and the number of dislocations decreases, when they refer to atoms migrating, what they're referring to is the subatomic structure in which we have yet to understand from a public level within that of the academic institutions, pertaining to the way in which these atoms reorganize, that is being controlled at an even more subatomic level or subcrystalline level, if you will, using quantum transportation by the Regalions in servitude to the interdimensional beings. And if you check out the previous Let's Get Banned episode that came out just before this or will come out shortly after this, you'll see a little bit more of what I'm referring to. Now, that is what annealing is, and that is how it could be applied to many different things, graphene oxide, you name it, right? But I got to be a little careful publicly on YouTube, not so much on Patreon, but on YouTube because of the things that they're censoring these days with graphene oxide and you know what else. Anyways, let's take a look at what Camp X was, according to Wikipedia. Camp X was the unofficial name of the Secret Special Training School number 103, a Second World War British paramilitary installation for training covert agents in the methods required for success in clandestine operations. It was located on the northwestern shore of Lake Ontario between Whitby and Oshawa in Ontario, Canada. This area is known today as Intrepid Park. Okay? End quote. The reason this is brought up, it doesn't have to do with the fact that it's in Canada or located of any kind within its geographical vicinity of there being any significance or importance, but the significance about this here, folks, is that this Camp X, basically in fancy, spy terms, they were saying trained people, trained agents and officers from, the Allies, the US, Israel, the UK, you name it, to be able to covertly complete and successfully complete their clandestine operations. But ultimately, what was really done there, and again, interestingly enough, notice how today it's a park, right? An intrepid park, very similar to that of the national parks, you name it, right? Notice how these former bases all of a sudden have become parks or large, vast amounts of land that the government must acquire or keep and remain acquired in a legal sense on the surface level of the law. Why? Because the energetic apparatus from the top down creates a system in which these experiments took place to create a multiverse experiment, that was disassociated from the Venusians and the Nordics, in which allegedly are trying to help us more so than that of which what is occurring with the Regalions and the Greys, which again, according to the previous or the upcoming, depending when this gets released, Let's Get Banned episode, you'll see that we cover this more significantly quite as well based on, the Cornwall and many other different crop circle incidences that seem to occur relative to the way in which Camp X was explained here. Now, Project Geppetto was a sub-project within Camp X. Now, yes, it was named after Geppetto, the character or the father of Pinocchio, because of how many lies there were. And it was sort of nicknamed. It started as a joke, but it officially became named that because those within the operation didn't even know what was going on because of how compartmentalized things were. There were compartments within compartments, right? And they started naming it Geppetto, and that was the name that became that. So, as it pertains to the example I gave at the beginning of you being a scientist and noticing humanoid figures start to all of a sudden become much more thin, not even human really, humanoid, bipedal, but not human, has to do with the annealing and the annealments of these different craft. Why do I say that? If you look up any FLIR images, or FLIR images, whatever you want to call it, of military radar tracking UFOs, not all of them, but a lot of them have heat emitting off of them, okay? And that has to do with the ability to create these alternative arcanes in an esoteric sense to allow for these annealments to take place. Now you might be saying, Dave, arcanes is just a word that means secret, right? But if there is a value within the 0-point field that one could interface with technology and thought, as Camden will actually dedicate a whole episode to, by the way, thank you, brother, of course, if you can actually apply the method of interfacing with thought, and you amongst a handful of others are the only ones that know of this, therefore thought and knowledge could manifest into the metaphysical realm, you actually have not a higher vibration, but a more in tune vibration, regardless if your intentions are positive or negative. How do we know this? Let's take a look at news.ucsb.edu. An ancient disaster. Researchers present evidence that a cosmic impact destroyed a biblical city in the Jordan Valley. Okay, September 20th, 2001. All right, it's an incredibly culturally important area, says James Kennett, emeritus professor of earth science at UC Santa Barbara. Much of where the early cultural complexity of humans developed is in this general area. Okay. Now take a look at this. A favorite site for archaeologists and biblical scholars, the mound hosts evidence of culture all the way from the Chalcolithic, or Copper Age, all compacted into layers as the highly strategic settlement was built, destroyed, and rebuilt over millennia. Now look at this. But there was a 1.5 meter interval in the Middle Bronze Age 2 stratum that caught the interest of some researchers for its highly unusual materials. All right. In addition to the debris one would expect from destruction via warfare and earthquakes, they found pottery shards with outer surfaces melted into glass, bubbled mud brick, and partially melted building material. All indications of an anomalously high temperature event, much hotter than anything that technology of the time could produce. We saw evidence for temperatures greater than 2,000 degrees Celsius, said Kenneth, whose research group at the time happened to have been building the case for an older cosmic airburst about 12,800 years ago. Okay, end quote. Now, interesting. I want to call it like it is. Let's be fair. Gaia.com, whatever you want to think of them. I know because a lot of they're owned by a majority BlackRock, so it's hard to say if there's an intelligence influence there or not. I would argue there is. But these websites have been discussing this for a long time now. Why is it that all of a sudden within UC Santa Barbara, all these ASU, all these highly respected universities, they can suddenly talk about it? Why? Because the alternative arcanes within the elemental process of esotericism them, have allowed for energetic subatomic molecules to be granted to different beings across the planet to disseminate this knowledge in a way that the Regalions and the interdimensional beings, and again, we can call them different things, Regalions may not be the name, but the way in which they want this to curate and be controlled. Now, the reason I bring this up, it's only going to get even more interesting, folks. Take a look at this right here. ResearchGate.net. Degradation patterns in water and oxygen of an inverted a polymer solar cell from 2010. Now, the spatial distribution of reaction products in multi-layer polymer solar cells induced by water and oxygen atmospheres was mapped and used to elucidate the degradation patterns and failure mechanisms in an inverted polymer solar cell. Okay, it was found that the reactions taking place at the interface between the active layer and the PSS were the major cause of device failure in the case of these inverted devices, which are compatible with full roll-to-roll coding and industrial manufacture. Okay, now the PSS was found to phase separate, with P-rich phase being responsible for most of the interface degradation in oxygen atmospheres. Okay, end quote. Interesting. Now, you might be saying, Dave, I have no idea what you're talking about here. Folks, inverted oxygen. I kid you not. You might be thinking, what do you mean by inverted? Well, it's more of an entropic, intuitive inversion. And I guess, honestly, I know I've been using this as quite a significant example for a while, but honestly, my best example for this would probably be the film Tenet. Now, let's take a look at vesselproject.io. Quantum annealing, a search for the best state. Remember what I just said about the FLIR images of noticing that they have some type of heat being emitted off of, not all of them, but some of them. Take a look. Quantum annealing is a type of quantum computing used mainly for optimization problems, okay? These problems can have many variables with many possible solutions, but we want to find the best solution. Okay, a network of interacting quantum bits, or qubits, are used to solve problems in quantum annealing. A qubit represents a variable having a spin of either up or down to indicate how that variable fits into the whole solution, like ones and zeros in binary code. But unlike other forms of computing, quantum annealing does not actively control the state of every variable. Instead, it allows qubits to naturally evolve based on simply programmed criteria, end quote. The reason I bring this up relative to the heat signatures emitting from these craft, folks, is because what we're going to find here is that the heat emitting from the craft are harnessing quantum annealments relative to the 2001 degradation patterns in water and oxygen of an inverted polymer solar cell, relative to what is occurring in the interdimensional transfusion or conflation of occurring in different alternative arcanes, or different multiverses, if you will, to allow for these cacodemonic beings to occur, which again, you'll see in the upcoming Let's Get Banned episode, the poltergeist activities occurring very shortly after these UFOs seem to appear. It's quite up for debate as to what it could fully be, but ultimately, folks, what we're also going to find here too, and I brought this up, I believe, 7 or 8 months ago, is having to do with undead UFOs. So not only UFOs or alien craft that are larger on the inside than the outside, having to do with, pocket dimensions and things like this, but also craft in which are inverted in the sense that we could define it as that of a negative entity or demonic entity. But let's put the word demonic aside for a second. Let's understand what we're really looking at here, okay? SingularityHub.com. The CRISPR family tree holds a multitude of untapped gene editing tools. Thanks to CRISPR, gene therapy and designer babies are now a reality. The gene editing Swiss Army knife is one of the most impactful biomedical discoveries of the last decade. Now, a new study suggests we've just begun dipping our toes into the CRISPR pond. And okay, yeah, whatever. We haven't just started as a species. No, we haven't just started dipping our toes into it, but there have been alternative arcanes that have the knowledge of this, that have not allowed for the dissemination of this information. But it's interesting how now all of a sudden it's available. Again, I got to be careful with the way in which I talk about how COVID has panned out. But if you take a look at how all of a sudden, COVID vaccines and, CRISPR gene therapy and mRNA and all of a sudden it's come out. Quite interesting, right? And the reason I say that is because if we understand that from an esoteric level, alternative arcanes could be not just alternate universes or multiverses, if you will. They are different universes of thought, individual and separate from that of the consciousness of thought that is tied to us here within this dimension. How do I know? How can we presume this or propose this? Well, let's take a look at this right over here. MedicalExpress.com. Novel device for exploratory imaging enables about 1,000 times more access to brain tissue. Science is examining the brain's neural activity for applications ranging from innovative therapies for brain-related injuries and disease to computational learning architectures for artificial intelligence intelligence and deep neural networks, end quote. This, folks, is a bunch of gibberish in my humble opinion, relative to the ultimate element of preventing mass consciousness for coming together. Now, why do we say that? Take a look at this. ScienceTimes.com. Scientist successfully achieves first ever quantum and data teleportation in human history. Okay, the medium used to achieve quantum and data teleportation were 2 computer chips. That was done in only 2019. Quantum entanglement was the means they transferred the chips, though through a non-physical vacuum. This means no wires, and by linking 2 quantum particles in a gap with concepts from quantum physics, end quote. This is nothing new. The reason I'm bringing this up is because this has to do with the way in which the propaganda is being disseminated into that of the mass consciousness mind of creating the problem, then creating the solution. So they found the issue within that 2010 ResearchGate article we were looking at. They found the issue. I say that with air quotes. They have now found the solution, and or the problem has been totally solved. Who can we attribute a lot of these findings to? The Tavistock Institute. What is that? Thank you very much, by the way, Lisa, for bringing this up in the members Zoom call. I appreciate it. Wikipedia.org. The Tavistock Institute of Human Relations is a British not-for-profit organization, which applies social science to contemporary issues and problems. It was initiated in 1946 when it developed from the Tavistock Clinic and was formally established as a separate entity in September 1947, end quote. Now, a lot of people might be saying, okay, Dave, what does this have to do with anything? They're an institute of human relations and social sciences, you name it. Well, alternative arcanes at the subatomic level are able to access the ether, in which there are certain individuals that interface with this through the 0-point field, and people that do this on the surface level need to have a job in this society for the social hierarchy and power structure to continue on. Where do they have these jobs? The Tavistock Institute. Interestingly enough, it's their founders. It says it right here. Elliot Jack, Henry Dix, Leonard Brown, Ronald Hargreaves, right? Wilfred Bion and Tommy Wilson. Look into all of these individuals. I'm not trying to slander them nor defame them, but the point I'm trying to make here is look at their history and look at their past. They each seem to have a connection, relation, blood relation, or association with certain esoteric experiments having to do with remote viewing and many other things as well. Now, take a look at this. NewScientist.com. Teleporting larger objects becomes real possibility. February 6th, 2002. You're telling me they don't have this by now? You see what I'm saying here, folks? Now, let's take a look at this right over here. This is from UFO sightings hotspot.blogspot.com. This is from a Phobos 2, okay, from the Russian spacecraft, or the Russian, I guess you could say, the Soviet satellite, if you will. These are some images of Mars and a cigar-shaped mothership shortly before, okay, everything cut right away, before the transmission cut and they lost contact. Why was this photo so significant? Because there's been photos of cigar-shaped motherships accidentally caught on space satellites all the time. We know that, right? This has to do with the transportation, okay, of an experiment called Universe 25. But Universe 25 does not only have to do with just the 25th universe in which these extraterrestrials and interdimensional beings have allocated us to be a part of this alternative arcane influence via the archons, but also it has to do with the way in which mass consciousness is directed. And let's take a look right here at this. So, IFLscience.com, Universe 25, the mouse utopia experiment that turned into an apocalypse. Okay, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but anyways, take a look at this right over here. John B. Callan set about, and I quote, creating a series of experiments that would essentially cater to every need of rodents and then track the effect on the population over time. The most infamous of the experiments was named Universe 25. In this study, he took 4 breeding pairs of mice and placed them inside a utopia. The environment was designed to eliminate problems that would lead to mortality in the wild. Now, before I go on, allegedly off the record, the former space defense minister, pardon me for forgetting his name, who said that there are experiments and there is, I believe, humans working with aliens in underground bases on Mars with the hexagonal base shapes and things like this. It's interesting that he says this, allegedly says this off the record, because again, when you look at some of the hexagons that are, I guess you could say, that are reoccurring throughout nature, not just on Earth, but within space, it's interesting to see that the alternative arcanes could in fact manifest themselves to the knowledge of thought, and which at the subatomic level allows for quantum tunneling to occur in ways that we can barely see, which is why the Phobos 2 image is so significant, okay? Now take a look. In this study, he took 4 breeding pairs of mice and placed them inside a quote-unquote utopia. The environment was designed to eliminate problems that would lead to mortality in the wild. They could access limitless food via 16 food hoppers, accessed via tunnels, which would feed up to 25 mice at a time, as well as water bottles just above. Nestling material was provided. The weather was kept at 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which for those of you who aren't mice is the perfect mouse temperature. The mice were chosen for their health, obtained by the National Institute of Health Breeding Colony. And by the way, that's something we'll get into in the members episode coming up shortly as well. Either the one coming up or the following one, but let's take a look. When the population hit 620, that slowed to doubling around every 145 days as the mouse society began to hit problems. The mice split off into groups, and those that could not find a role in these groups found themselves with nowhere to go. Okay? In the normal course of events in a natural ecological setting, somewhat more young survive to maturity than are necessary to replace their dying or senescent established associates, Callan wrote in 1972. The excess that find no social niches emigrate. Okay? End quote. Now, I bring this up because what was discussed here and written here, by Mr. Calhoun seems to be representative of the reptilian agenda that correlates, again, with the experiment that seems to be disseminated from the 70s and onwards into mainstream media. Again, how many in films, for example, forget aliens, but how many bad guys say, depopulation? Even look at Thanos. We can argue very strongly the Marvel Avengers with Thanos. Half the universe needs to be wiped out in order for there to be balance. Too much population is not good. Interesting that this is consistent with a lot of eyewitness encounters and testimonies that seem to have occurred relative, again, to the Phobos 2 imagery, because it seems as though there may have not been that type of, I guess you could say, the Venusians, if you will, were not necessarily pleased that this particular craft was seen. Not because it was seen going in and out of Mars, but because of the esoteric, energetic forms that it inhabited. And even just by looking at the image, instills within everyday people like you and I, alternative arcanes that could help form another multiverse that the elites do not want to occur or happen. Now, the final thing, and I quote, "Males who failed withdrew physically and psychologically. They became very inactive and aggregated in large pools near the center of the floor of the universe. From this point on, they no longer initiated interaction with their established associates, nor did their behavior elicit attack by territorial males. Even so, they became characterized by many wounds and much scar tissues as a result of attacks by other withdrawn males." End quote. The reason this is brought up is because this is directly correlated to Walter Russell's Universal One book. Okay, and the reason I say that is because ultimately, if we take a look back here at medicalexpress.com, novel device for exploratory imaging enables about 1,000 times more access to brain tissue. Okay, the system called compact, clear, optically matched panoramic access channel technique advances the use of high-resolution optical imaging in a living brain to investigate the function and adaptability of neural circuits underpinning behavior. End quote. The neural circuits underpinning behavior and the subatomic atoms within that structure started moving and separating just like the mouse did in the Universe 25 experiment. So folks, I know this is a lot to take in. It's a lot to absorb. You might be saying, Dave, what the hell were you talking about this entire time? It has to do with the emergence of interdimensional beings and what we were to be called science in a biological sense, the way at least we refer to it as. And knowledge literally being, not just because we know it, but because of the manifestation of remote viewing and interfacing with the 0-point field, not 0-point energy, the 0-point field, allows for us to be able to realize that our minds operate in a similar way as these mouse do. And if we can compartmentalize in a mental form, we can actually break free of that mental structure and social structure that has been put under all of us, or at least the vast majority of us. So with that being said, folks, thank you so very much for watching and listening, and we'll catch all of you very, very soon. Cheers.